Here we go. What if I told you that after the Great Society, Lyndon B. Johnson's great movement to effect change, particularly among the social services, the government thought and decided that we need to regulate the nonprofit sector. Matter of fact, they went ahead and even as recently as after 9/11, when it was discovered that terror groups were using charities to distribute funds into the United States, it was further suggested that the U.S. should more regulate the charitable sector. Well, back in the 60s, when this occurred, a wonderful group, an amazing group of thought leaders got together and developed a set of best practices and went to the government and said, allow us to self-regulate. Of course, it makes sense, and we want to fight for that moment to this day. We always want to be able to self-regulate the nonprofit sector, which is why a set of best practices was established that was based on accountability. Ethics and accountability. Now imagine this. You end up developing a set of best practices which largely remain unchanged and in place to this day. But they're based on ensuring that a CEO doesn't embezzle. Now, we believe in best practices, we believe in ethics and accountability, but to design best practices whose cornerstone is accountability is actually the opposite of growth. Best practices should be designed not based on accountability. Best practices need to be designed for the purpose of ensuring enterprise growth. We have looked at all of the best practice sets. You know them. Wonderful organizations. We believe well-meaning organizations. But the truth of the matter is, they have led to a stagnation in the charitable sector that remains to this day. We celebrate this false metric every year. Somewhere, this year it was Giving USA, $373 billion was given by Americans charitably. The problem has been, since I entered this profession, it's been 27 years now. In the last 20 years, the word, 290 billion up to 300 and something billion, in 20 years, though it fluctuates and it goes up and it goes down. The truth of the matter is we've been stagnated. We have not grown. And that is in no small part to the burden and the shackles we've placed on ourselves by developing best practices that are based on accountability and ethics, rather, instead of developing best practices that are based on growth. Now, please know that those growth best practices, those new guidelines, will be supported and protected by accountability. But let's go back to the point of non-growth. Dan Pallotta made that point in his wonderful TED Talk that over the past 40 years, there have been 45,000 for-profit corporations that have exceeded the $50 million mark. In that same time period, he noted that only 150 nonprofits exceeded the $50 million mark. And the percentage of gross national product that we command hasn't grown but 1 or 2% in 50 years. What if I told you that in the next 30 years, every year the nonprofit sector commands about $1.5 trillion. Hospitals, universities, all the social sectors, religion, they oversee and administrate and distribute and spend $1.5 trillion. That's over a 30-year period, that's nearly $35 trillion. You would think that with that much money, we could eradicate issues and problems worldwide, issues of scale. And the difficulty is, you'd be wrong. It's in no small part because of the constructs we put in place, though well-meaning, that are actually preventing us from being all that we can be. So, what if a board of governors, a new generation of leaders, the individuals that are on this call with us right now, came together over the next 6 months and took the work of some of the most brilliant experts, leading experts in nonprofit management, doctors, donors, corporate heads, took their work and evaluated it for the purpose of coming up with a new set of governing best practices that supercharge capacity building, that ensure you and I have everything that we need to realize our important missions. What if I then told you we are going to equip, through credentialing, a new generation of leaders with these new best practices who, how do you put it? who are equipped to design heroic missions of scale. Heroic missions of scale. What's that look like? Well, that's one of the new guidelines. We have to decide, what is scale? But if we raised up a new generation of leaders who are credentialed, and who would we credential? We'll credential the CEOs, the CFOs, the COOs. Do you know there's no national credential right now that a membership organization oversees that equips a CEO, a CFO, or a CEO to be a best practice expert? So let's credential all the C-suite executives. Then let's credential all of the fundraisers. And then let's credential all of the consultants with a new set of best practices that supercharge capacity building, who then, and I'll say it one last time, are equipped with the ability to design historic missions of scale that supercharge nonprofit capacity building. Okay, we're going to begin and show you now how this all began. I got a call from Dr. Kathleen Robinson. Kathy and I have known each other for 13 years. She was responsible for making sure that many of the funds that came from the Faith-Based and Community Initiative, making sure that those funds were distributed in South Carolina. That was 12 years ago. Well into our relationship, we began to understand that Paul Light had written a book called Sustaining Nonprofit Performance, The Case for Capacity Building. He wrote this in 2004. In 2010, Kathy and I got on the phone with each other, and we said we need to evaluate the success, because here's what happened. The White House, the Faith-Based Initiative, foundations, donors, they all decided that because of this book, that they needed to give restricted gifts to capacity building. They needed to give nonprofits not only a gift for program, but they also needed to give each nonprofit a restricted gift for capacity building. Put in place fundraising infrastructure, hire a director of development. So, Kathy wrote the book. Well, it's actually a shorter book, Origin and Evolutions of Nonprofit Function. In here, we find out and discover why we've gotten to this point with best practices. We then looked at the Paul Light book and decided that we had to establish a new survey. Paul was hired by Princeton University sometime between 2000 and 2004 to perform that capacity building survey. He monitored nonprofits who were getting capacity building gifts. He then tried to accomplish a statistical type study, but we realized that he didn't actually reach a clinical sample. So some of the findings may or may not be accurate. With that being said, come forward to 2010, Clemson University with Kathy Robinson got with me, Jimmy LaRose, and National Development Institute, and we were able to work with our alumni and the different individuals that use National Development Institute's capacity building resources, and we were able to survey and reach a clinical sample of over 490 nonprofit executives who had received a capacity building gift in the last 10 years. So, 90 question survey, capacity building gift was received by the nonprofit in the last 10 years, and here's what we found out and discovered. 85% of nonprofits in that decade who received a capacity building gift, 85% of them in no way, shape, or form built new capacity. So, I guess that doesn't surprise us, does it? Because we understand why. It's hard to build capacity when constrained by a set of best practices that are failing us. So, we took that information and worked with Dr. Kimberly Brown, and we affectionately talk about the Brown dissertation. And the name of this dissertation, her doctoral thesis, is Factors Explaining Nonprofit Leaders' Intention to Build Capacity. NANOE was born because the first thing that happened was factors explaining nonprofit leaders' intention to build capacity. This gets down in the weeds. How do we find out from not the 85% that failed, but how do we find out from the 15% that actually exceeded and raised more money than they've ever raised? And by the way, all of this survey occurred post-2008 recession. So this data is accurate. This data reflects a whole new set of information that we can rely on, and that we can begin to build a new set of best practices that promotes enterprise growth. So here's what I'm trying to say. Out of the doctoral thesis came all sorts of research briefs. The strong CEO. How do we define capacity? Beliefs and intentions. Beliefs that affect intentions to build nonprofit capacity. 6 key documents. Documents that indicate nonprofit performance effectiveness and results. All of these are in NANOE's capacity building library. We're going to learn about that a little bit later. I forgot to tell you what we did after Dr. Brown's dissertation was written, those research briefs were written. I wrote this book, Reimagining Philanthropy. And the Roger Slater Foundation made sure that 1,400 major donors received a copy of this. And this allowed us to receive a whole new set of information where we were able to challenge major donors as to this unconventional way of fundraising, this unconventional board management, this unconventional approach to the strong CEO. And I want you to know, invariably, 95% loved it. 5% had a question. 95% said, this is the way I run my for-profit corporation. Of course, this is the way we need to run the nonprofit sector. So you had the Brown dissertation. You then had all those research briefs. I distilled it and made it accessible to the general marketplace, but more importantly, to the capacity builders themselves, the true customers of the nonprofit sector, the donors who purchase the opportunity to have a stake, a transformational stake in your meaningful cause. They want to advance an issue. You know, I'm fond of saying nonprofits mistakenly think that the student or the rainforest or the homeless individual is their customer. They're not your customer, and you want to know why? They don't have no money. The government is providing us contracts. We do have some social entrepreneurship that gives us income. Donors provide capacity. There's different income resources. So we took it to the donors, and they said, this is the correct approach. Okay, one more little step. The first one, of course, was the Brown dissertation. The second one was the research briefs. The third was Reimagining Philanthropy. But then, Dr. Robinson wrote new guidelines, not for today's nonprofit, for tomorrow's nonprofit. Friends, we cannot go back and disrupt this moment, what we are overseeing and managing. This is meant to be a process whereby which, with grace and propriety, we figure out the next right steps for the nonprofit to supercharge capacity building. So Dr. Robinson wrote new guidelines for tomorrow's nonprofit. This is the first. But my point is, between the doctoral thesis and all the research briefs, we've discovered new guidelines. And we're saying this is for tomorrow's nonprofit. New guidelines for tomorrow's nonprofit that we believe are going to allow nonprofits to really soar. Let me get back to that metric of Giving USA. $379 billion was raised in 2015. And, you know, we celebrate that, and I explained that we've hovered around that for nearly 20 years, you know, with it up and down, you know, 280 billion to 380 billion. I know there's growth there, but what if I said this? You don't get any points for raising $373 billion if you actually need $900 billion to get the job done. Especially when the $900 billion is there for the taking. So, when I say we are holding these big ideas loosely in our hands, I just want you to know that we're still yet to find out and discover many new things, and we're going to do it together. And it's going to be important to be humble as we go through and we work through these processes. We're going to make huge mistakes. But I think on the other side of it, we're going to transform millions of lives. We're going to end up eradicating problems of scale. We're going to end up eliminating issues that are affecting the globe. And I promise you that we can. You know, those of us who are crazy enough to believe that we can actually change the world, Sometimes we do. And I think that's why we've asked this Board of Governors to convene, so we can understand what role you can play in helping us codify and review these new best practices. Now, I know that some people have been running out of the room with their hair on fire. But what if I told you this? When you look at the data, these actually aren't new best practices. They're actually what the 15% that succeeded, remember, 10-year period, all these nonprofits, 490 of them received a capacity building gift. 85% of them didn't raise new capacity. 15% did. What if I told you that these best practices are based on what the 15% of the nonprofits that succeeded did? So these aren't new best practices. They're what's working now. But they do fly in the face of convention. And some of our intermediate nonprofits, our fellow associations, are just struggling with the idea of even talking about it. Even talking about these things. People are being told that, well, I don't even know how to put it, that maybe the nonprofit sector, maybe those of you who are watching right now, aren't capable of having this discussion, that we're going to cause confusion. And I just think that you can be trusted to make a decision on your own, especially when you find out the truth.